The hum of the industrial ventilation system was a constant, low thrum against the metal frame of the observation gallery. Below me, bathed in the stark glow of overhead fluorescence, lay the subject of our current, rather mundane inquiry. Not a person, not anymore, but a collection of biological remnants on a stainless steel table. My gaze drifted from the discolored tissue samples to the detailed photographs pinned to a nearby board, then back to the scene below. Searching for a rhythm, a pattern, anything that would betray the individual who had left this messy, tragic signature. This repurposed corner of the abandoned factory, once a bustling assembly line, now served as an ad hoc processing center for the deeply unpleasant. Concrete floors, scarred by decades of heavy machinery, had been scrubbed clean and sealed, but the faint, metallic tang of industrial solvents still lingered beneath the sharper, more clinical sense of disinfectants and decay. From my vantage point in the empty observation gallery, I could see everything on the main floor, yet remain unseen, a ghost in the machine of human consequence. It was how I preferred it. Distance sharpened the focus. The case was a textbook example of reckless indifference. A driver, impaired, swerving off a remote road, leaving a scene that spoke volumes of panic and a callous disregard for life. My task was to construct a psychological profile of the perpetrator based on the absence of certain behaviors. No attempt to aid, no call for help, no signs of remorse at the scene itself. A cold, calculated flight. My pen scratched across my notepad, charting the progression of thought, the decision points, the likely psychological makeup of someone who could commit such an act and simply vanish into the night. An avoidant personality, perhaps with narcissistic tendencies. Predictable, easy almost. I was mid-sentence, detailing the probable shame avoidance mechanisms, when the heavy steel door to the gallery creaked open behind me. I didn't turn immediately, my focus still glued to a particularly telling tire mark in one of the photographs. Grant, the voice was tight, strained. It belonged to the detective, a man whose weary eyes usually held a flicker of cynical amusement. Now replaced by something else entirely. Urgency. I finally turned, my notepad still open in my hand. He stood silhouetted against the dimmer light of the hallway, a file clutched in his hand like a lifeline. His usual crisp shirt was rumpled and he hadn't shaved. This wasn't about the hit and run. "Something's come in," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if the very air might carry the words to unintended ears. Something big. I closed my notebook. The mundane profile instantly forgotten. The detective rarely showed this level of distress. My stomach tightened, a familiar knot of apprehension forming. "Big how?" He stepped fully into the gallery, the door hissing shut behind him. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide, disturbed. "Remember the Evans case? From what, 6 years ago? The missing woman, Clara Evans?" The name hit me like a physical blow. Clara Evans. The case had haunted the city for years. A young woman vanishing without a trace, leaving behind a bewildered family and a trail of dead ends. I'd followed it like everyone else, but had never been officially involved. What about it? He walked over to the reinforced glass, his gaze sweeping over the sterile scene below, though I knew he wasn't seeing the tissue samples. He was seeing something far worse. They found her. Where? Under a new development site out near the old industrial park, buried deep and... There were others. He paused, taking a ragged breath. 2 others, recent, very recent. My mind raced, connecting the dots he was laying out. The impossible suddenly seemed terrifyingly real. Linked how? "The same signature," he said, his jaw clenching. He pushed a hand through his already disheveled hair. "The way they were handled, the specific, almost ritualistic dismemberment, the absence of certain organs, it's identical. We've got Clara Evans and 2 other victims who disappeared just last month, all bearing the same mark." My gaze fell back to the stainless steel table, to the precise, clinical way the mundane evidence below was being processed. This was different. This wasn't reckless indifference. This was deliberate, calculated, terrifyingly specific. An absence of certain organs. I repeated, the words tasting like ash. This wasn't just about disposal, it was about acquisition. "Exactly," he confirmed, his voice barely audible. "And that's not even the worst of it. The Evans case, there was a witness, a young woman who claimed she saw Clara being forced into a car, but her story was inconsistent, she recanted, and eventually he was dismissed as unreliable, mentally unstable." I felt a familiar prickle of unease. Unreliable witnesses dismissed too quickly often held the key. What about him? He was one of the recent victims, Grant, the second one found. The air in the gallery seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. The witness to the initial disappearance, murdered years later, by the same hand that claimed the original victim. A predator who remembered, who waited, who tied up loose ends with brutal precision. Wait, I said, my mind starting to piece together the horrifying implications. If the witness was dismissed as unreliable, unstable, did anyone ever truly look into her claims from a psychological standpoint? He shook his head slowly, his eyes meeting mine, reflecting the sudden horror. They didn't. They just filed it away. And now she's dead, and we have a killer who waited 6 years to finish what he started and then kept going. A ghost, Grant, a ghost who just came back to life. The predictable profile of the hit-and-run driver vanished from my mind, replaced by a swirling vortex of questions. This wasn't about profiling a single act of passion or negligence. My own past traumas, those ghosts I kept locked away, stirred in their slumber. This case wasn't just complex. It felt like a direct confrontation, a mirror held up to the very nature of deceit. The fluorescent hum above was the only sound in the teaching hospital morgue, empty observation gallery above. It cast a sickly, sterile glow over the stack of files before me, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. Below, through the thick, soundproof glass, the stainless steel gleamed, reflecting the harsh light in an otherwise silent chamber. No activity, just the ghost of what usually transpired there. It was a strange place to set up shop, but the chief investigator insisted on a neutral, secure location, and this one was certainly that. Isolated, perfect for uninterrupted focus, or for letting old ghosts whisper. I pulled the first file towards me, its manila cover brittle with age. In person, Elena Vance, 2008. The paper inside was yellowed, the ink faded in places. A photograph clipped to the first page showed a young woman with a vibrant, almost defiant smile. She'd vanished without a trace from a small coastal town, leaving behind a meticulously tidy apartment and a note saying he was going for a drive. No body, no struggle, just gone. The original investigation detailed endless searches, fruitless interviews, theories ranging from elopement to accidental drowning. Nothing stuck. The case had gone cold faster than a winter night. I skimmed through the initial police interviews. A boyfriend, distraught but with a solid alibi. A few friends, all equally baffled. A landlord who remembered her as quiet, polite, always paid rent on time. The routine stuff. What struck me even then was the sheer absence of anything. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. No discarded possessions. It was as if Elena had simply dematerialized. The only oddity, noted almost as an afterthought, was the absence of her favorite, distinctive silver locket, a family heirloom, according to her mother. The investigator at the time had chalked it up to something she might have worn or taken with her. I made a mental note. Next, I opened the file on the recent murder. The contrast was immediate, jarring. This file was crisp, thick, overflowing with digital printouts, glossy photographs, and the stark language of modern forensics. The victim, a young student named Clara Albright, found 3 weeks ago in an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. I flipped through the photos. Clara's body had been arranged with a grotesque precision, posed almost artfully, not just dumped, but placed. Her hands, I noticed, were clasped together, almost as if in prayer, though her face, distorted by the trauma, bore no such peaceful expression. And there, nestled between her clasped fingers, was a small, tarnished silver locket. My breath hitched. The description of Elena's missing locket from her mother's statement had been vague. A small silver locket, oval-shaped, with a faint engraving of a bird. The one in the photo, clutched by Clara, was oval-shaped, silver, even through the grainy image. I could just make out the faint etching of what looked undeniably like a bird. Coincidence? My gut twisted. That's what they'd called it initially, I knew. A macabre, meaningless detail. But for a forensic psychologist, there was no such thing as meaningless detail. Everything meant something. I dove deeper into Clara's file. The crime scene report was meticulously detailed. No fingerprints, no DNA that didn't belong to the victim. The killer had left nothing behind, save for the locket, too clean, too perfect. It screamed premeditation, a meticulousness that went beyond mere caution. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a statement. Then I hit the interview transcripts. A colleague from the original investigation, a veteran detective, had spoken to Clara's friends and family. Clara was quiet, studious, a creature of habit. No enemies, no obvious vices. Her disappearance had been sudden, just like Alina's. She told her roommate he was going for a walk. No struggle, no sign of forced entry into her apartment, just gone for days until her body was found. My eyes darted between the two files. Alina Vance going for a drive. Clara Albright going for a walk. Both vanished without a trace, only for one to reappear years later, gruesomely linked to a new victim, both leaving behind an air of quiet departure. And now, the locket. This was a meticulously crafted narrative, years in the making. The killer wasn't just ahead of the investigators, they were orchestrating the entire plot. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. There was I seeing patterns where none existed. There was the pressure of this case, the weight of the years and the new brutality, making me connect dots that were merely random specks. My own past, the cases that had haunted me, whispered at the edges of my perception. I had to be careful, had to be objective, but the locket, that wasn't random, that was deliberate. I turned back to Clara's autopsy report, specifically the toxicology screen. Negative for everything. No sedatives, no struggle, no defensive wounds. How had this meticulous predator managed to abduct Clara without leaving a trace? And why no struggle, unless? My gaze fell on a single line buried deep in the preliminary findings from Clara's scene, a faint, almost imperceptible residue on the victim's shoes. Described as fine, crystalline particulate, consistent with industrial-grade cleaning agent. It had been dismissed as environmental contamination from the abandoned factory. But what if it wasn't? What if it was left by design? An almost invisible signature of a mind that cleaned up every single loose end, every single piece of evidence. Except for one, the locket. The locket was meant to be found. It was the thread, carefully placed, linking past to present. A cruel, calculated taunt. This wasn't just a killer, this was a storyteller, and they were just beginning their tale. And I, it seemed, was now a character in it. Below, through the thick, soundproof glass, the stainless steel gleamed, reflecting the stark, clinical light. My fingers, still cool from the chill, traced the faded photograph of the young woman from the cold case, Sarah Jennings. Her smile, frozen in time, seemed to mark the years of silence. I closed the file with a soft thud, the sound echoing too loudly in the quiet space. More hours poring over autopsy reports and witness statements wouldn't give me what I needed. Not yet. The sterile environment, while necessary for the pathologists, was a cage for my thoughts. I needed the air, the grit, the lingering energy of the places where these lives had been irrevocably altered. I needed to see the canvas the killer had painted on. It was located in an older part of the city, a block of brick buildings with fire escapes zigzagging up their exteriors like metal vines. The building itself felt tired, its once vibrant red bricks now faded to a dull terracotta, and the windows, many boarded up, stared out like vacant eyes. The lead investigator from the original case, a man whose shoulders seemed permanently hunched with the weight of unsolved mysteries, met me at the curb. His name escaped me, but the weariness in his eyes was instantly familiar. "Grant," he greeted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Didn't expect anyone to dig this deep again. Sometimes the answers are just buried, not gone," I replied, my gaze sweeping over the building. He led me up 3 flights of creaking wooden stairs, the smell of dust and forgotten lives thick in the air. The apartment door, still bearing a faded evidence sticker, groaned open. The interior was a time capsule of neglect. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight piercing the grimy windows. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of mildew and old paper hung heavy. The furnishings, basic and sparse, had been left behind by the landlord. A cheap, floral-patterned sofa, a small dining table, and a single, unmade bed in the bedroom. "She disappeared from here," the original detective explained, gesturing vaguely around the small living room. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Just gone. I walked slowly, my shoes scuffing on the gritty floorboards. I wasn't looking for fingerprints, that had been done decades ago. I was looking for patterns, for an echo. I crouched by the window. It overlooked a narrow alleyway choked with weeds and discarded trash. "Easy access out back," I murmured. "Could be," he conceded. "But why leave through the back if there was no struggle inside?" "Precisely," I answered, rising. "It suggests a level of control. Either she left willingly with someone she knew, or someone convinced her to leave willingly, or they knew how to make it look like she left willingly." My eyes scanned the room again. Nothing overtly disturbed. No overturned lamps, no broken glass. It was too neat, too quiet for an abduction. No notes, no goodbye calls. Nothing, he affirmed, shaking his head. Her purse, keys, phone, all still here, like she just stepped out for a minute and never came back. Detail gnawed at me. The missing person scenario, so clean, so devoid of typical struggle, pointed to a perpetrator who understood human behavior, who could manipulate not just the victim, but the scene itself. It spoke of patience, of planning. Later that afternoon, the current lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, drove me to the site of the most recent murder. This was a stark contrast to Sarah's quiet apartment. The victim, a freelance graphic designer, had been found in a small, industrial warehouse district on the edge of town, a place of corrugated metal and faded graffiti. The air here smelled of damp concrete and diesel. Yellow crime scene tape still fluttered around a section of a derelict loading dock, a stark barrier against the mundane world. The victim's vehicle was found parked 2 blocks away. The current lead explained, her voice crisp. Walked here, apparently. No security cameras caught her approach. I stepped over the tape, careful to stay within the designated path. The ground was rough gravel, interspersed with patches of weeds. The warehouse itself was a cavernous shell, its windows long-shadowed, letting in slivers of weak light. The scene was less about domestic disappearance and more about calculated abandonment. The previous chapter's victim had been discovered here, a brutal end far from any comfort. The method of disposal. It's been consistent across the recent cases, I mused, keeping my voice low. Deliberate placement, almost theatrical. Like a message, she agreed, kicking a loose pebble with her boot. But what kind of message? Was still coming up blank on a motive. I walked to the edge of the loading dock, looking out at the desolate landscape. This killer wasn't just taking lives, they were crafting narratives. The killer had refined their technique, escalated their brutality. Underlying thread of control, of orchestrating a scene rather than just committing a crime, was undeniable. The lack of forensic evidence at the Jennings scene, coupled with the meticulous staging here, I began turning to face the current lead. It suggests someone who learns, someone who adapts. The first time they were careful to avoid leaving a trace, to make it look like a simple vanishing act. Now they're leaving traces, but they're controlled traces, designed to mislead, confuse. I think they're playing with us, she asked, a flicker of irritation in her eyes. More than playing, they're directing. The shift from a disappearance to a staged discovery is significant. It tells me they've grown bolder, more confident, but not careless. They're still thinking steps ahead. I ran a hand through my hair, a familiar tension building behind my eyes. The Jennings case was too clean, almost too perfect. And these recent cases, for all their violence, also have a strange, almost artistic precision to their aftermath. It's like the killer is trying to say something, but in a language only they understand. The wind picked up, rattling a loose sheet of metal on the warehouse roof. This wasn't just a killer, it was a performer, and we, the investigators, were just part of their audience. The cunning was profound, the control absolute. But there was something else, a small, nagging inconsistency between the pristine disappearance of Sarah Jennings and the brutal, almost ritualistic display of the later victims. It felt like 2 different artists, or perhaps one artist evolving so drastically they'd become unrecognizable. My initial profile, a picture of methodical, escalating violence, suddenly felt a little too neat itself. Maybe I was falling into the killer's trap, seeing what they wanted me to see. The thought left a bitter taste. The cool, sterile air of the teaching hospital morgue, empty observation gallery above, did little to calm the static buzzing behind my eyes. Below, through the thick pane of glass, the space was quiet, pristine, a stark contrast to the chaos it contained. My gaze drifted over the stainless steel examination tables, the array of implements all waiting. I pictured the bodies that would lie there, the stories they'd tell, or rather the stories we'd have to coax out of them. My mind, however, was still replaying the warehouse, the meticulously arranged tableau. A performer, I'd thought, not just a killer, but an artist of agony staging their work for an audience of one us. That realization had settled deep in my gut, a cold, hard knot. It wasn't just about finding who did it anymore. It was about understanding why they wanted us to see it, to react. A shuffling sound behind me announced the arrival of the lead detective. His face, usually a roadmap of weary determination, was etched with something new, a glimmer of hope. He held a tablet, its screen glowing faintly in the subdued light. "Grant," he responded, his voice hushed. "We have something." He leaned against the railing, turning the tablet to show me a grainy surveillance still. A man, mid-30s, average build, nondescript. Name's Dale, works in logistics. Fits my initial profile for a loner, meticulous. Someone with an obsessive streak but capable of blending in. I took the tablet, zooming in on the man's face. Nothing remarkable, just a face in a crowd. What's the connection? He knew the first victim, the young woman who disappeared years ago. The detective explained, his finger tapping the screen. Not well, but they worked in the same building for a brief period. More importantly, we found some peculiar items at his apartment. Drawings, sketches of the missing woman. Very detailed, and a collection of news clippings all about her disappearance. Some of them are years old. My brow furrowed. Obsessive, yes, but a killer? That's a leap from collecting clippings. We're not finished. The detective pressed on, a note of triumph creeping into his tone. His alibi for the recent murders is shaky. He claims he was home alone, no witnesses. And here's the kicker. One of the recent victims, the collector, had a unique antique pocket watch. We found it in Dale's apartment, tucked away in a locked drawer. My grip tightened on the tablet. A pocket watch. That was concrete. That was a direct link. It certainly fit the profile of a killer who might keep trophies, who might escalate from obsession to violence. The collector victim had been found in a similar, almost theatrical arrangement to the other recent deaths, though the cause of death had differed slightly. The common thread was the unsettling presentation. So, he knew the original victim, had an unhealthy obsession, a weak alibi, and physical evidence linking him to one of the recent murder scenes. I summarized, trying to connect the dots. It sounded solid, too solid perhaps. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor of unease started to snake through me. This was what we'd been searching for, a tangible lead. So why did it feel off? "We've brought him in for questioning," the detective continued, clearly buoyed by the breakthrough. "He's clamming up, denying everything, but the evidence is mounting." I handed back the tablet, my gaze returning to the silent tables below. "And the staging, the theatricality of the scenes, does that fit Dale?" The detective hesitated. "He's quiet, reserved, but who knows what goes on behind closed doors. Maybe this is his way of expressing some twisted fantasy." I nodded slowly, but the explanation felt thin, stretched. The killer I envisioned, the performer, had an almost arrogant flair, a deliberate artistry. Dale, from the brief glimpse I had, seemed more like a shadow, a whisper. The pocket watch, though, was a loud shout. It was a classic misdirection, a bright, shiny object. Wait, that doesn't add up. A performer wouldn't just leave a critical piece of evidence like that, not unless they wanted it to be found. And if they wanted it to be found, why? To frame someone. The next 2 days, the investigation pivoted. Dale became the singular focus. My colleagues reviewed his financials, his digital footprint, his sparse social circle. Everything pointed to a man who lived a life of quiet routine, a life that, on the surface, seemed incapable of such brutality, yet the watch, the drawings, the vague alibi. I spent hours poring over the case files, comparing Dale's known habits to the psychological patterns I'd been building for the killer. The meticulousness fit. The planning, perhaps, but the sheer audacity, the deliberate taunting implied by the crime scenes, that just didn't align with a man who seemed to actively avoid attention. My initial profiling had been broad, covering a range of possibilities, but the performer aspect had become a key differentiator. Dale felt like a low-budget understudy, not the lead actor. The weight, that doesn't add up, moment truly hit me late one evening, staring at a blown-up image of the antique pocket watch. It was a beautiful piece, intricate, clearly valuable, but the collector victim was known for a specific type of antique, pre-Victorian European timepieces. This watch, while old, was a common American brand from the early 20th century. It was valuable, yes, but it wasn't the kind of item that collector would have focused on, let alone treasured enough for it to be prominently displayed or even part of his most prized collection. It was an anomaly. I brought it up with the lead investigator. "Could it have been planted?" He scoffed. "Grant, it was in a locked drawer. Dale's key, it's solid. But it doesn't fit the victim's known collection habits," I argued, pushing past his dismissal. "It's an outlier. It feels too convenient." My gut churned. The discomfort festered. Then came the call. The reveal/discovery was stark and unequivocal. A neighbor, An elderly woman with a notoriously precise memory for daily routines had finally come forward. He had seen Dale every evening during the time frame of the recent murders, walking his cat on a leash down the street at exactly 8:17 p.m. Not only that, but her home's security camera, set to record due to a string of minor neighborhood incidents, had captured Dale's distinct figure on her driveway at those precise times, illuminated by her porch light. The timestamps were undeniable. He had a solid, verifiable alibi, not for one night, but for all of them. And the pocket watch, it turned out Dale did own it. It had been a gift from his late father. He'd shown it to a colleague at work months ago, lamenting that it was a cheap imitation, a sentimental trinket, not a valuable antique. The collector victim had never owned such a piece. The discovery of it in Dale's apartment wasn't a discovery at all, but a deliberate misinterpretation, or worse, a setup. The news clippings and drawings, while unsettling, proved only an obsession, not murder. Dale was a lonely man, perhaps disturbed, but not our killer. The relief in the detective's voice as he told me was palpable, quickly replaced by a wave of frustration. "He's clean," he grumbled. "We wasted 2 days on a dead end." My own frustration was mixed with a grim satisfaction. I doubted myself, had almost let the apparent fit sway me. But the killer's performance, their subtle narrative, was more intricate than I'd initially given credit for. Dale wasn't the performer, he was a prop, a carefully placed distraction. Someone had known about his eccentricities, about his alibi, about his watch, and used it to their advantage. The cunning was even deeper than I'd imagined. We weren't just the audience, we were characters in their macabre play, and the stage had just been reset. The fluorescent hum of the overhead lights in the observation gallery was a dull counterpoint to the silence. I sat hunched over a stack of files, the metal table cold beneath my forearms, my breath fogging slightly in the chilled air. Below, through the thick glass, the teaching hospital morgue lay quiet, sterile, and mercifully empty. No bodies, no frantic activity, just the stark white surfaces and the occasional drip of a cooling unit. It was an odd choice for a temporary workspace, but the lead investigator had cited security and an abundance of undisturbed space. My own frustration from the previous day, the realization that Dale was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated decoy, had sharpened into a grim determination. The killer wasn't just clever, they were theatrical. A puppet master pulling strings I hadn't even seen. I needed to peel back every layer, starting with the victims themselves. Their lives, their habits, their secret passions somewhere in the mundane, a pattern had to exist. I had been through the primary police reports, the witness statements, the forensic summaries. Now I was digging into the personal effects inventories, the journals, the social media profiles, anything that painted a picture beyond the crime scene. The first victim, a quiet librarian, then the restless graphic designer, followed by the ambitious young architect. 3 lives, seemingly disparate, linked only by the brutal, precise manner of their ends. Page after page, I scanned for anomalies. Shared acquaintances? No. Similar professional circles? Not really. Geographic proximity? Only loosely. I felt like a prospector panning for gold, sifting through endless gravel for a single precious fleck. Then I saw it. A brief mention in the librarian's personal effects. A collection of antique pocket watches, mostly incomplete, stored in a velvet-lined box. I paused, my finger hovering over the line. Odd but not unheard of, a niche hobby. I flipped to the graphic designer's file. Buried deep in a list of their digital assets, past the design software and the music files, was a folder titled Mechanisms. Inside, a series of high-resolution macro photographs, intricate gears, tiny springs, polished casings. My gut tightened. The lead investigator hadn't mentioned this. It was too specific, too obscure for a general report. Finally, the architect. Her apartment inventory included a workbench with various small tools, magnifying loupes, and several disassembled timepieces. The pieces clicked into place with a quiet, sickening finality. Not just watches, but antique pocket watches. Not just collecting, but repairing. Disassembling, understanding the intricate dance of time. Horology, a meticulous, solitary passion. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the lukewarm coffee mug beside me. It couldn't be a coincidence. 3 victims from different walks of life all shared this intensely specific, somewhat arcane hobby. It was a secret society of sorts, bound by the ticking of tiny gears. My mind reeled, pulling me back through years, decades even, to the scent of oil and brass. The rhythmic tick-tock, tick-tock that had once been the soundtrack to my own childhood. My father, he had been a horologist, not professionally, but with an obsessive devotion that consumed his evenings and weekends. Our old house, filled with the gentle chorus of clocks, each one a testament to his patience and skill. He taught me the basics, the delicate touch required, the quiet satisfaction of bringing a broken mechanism back to life. It was a world he'd retreated into, a world of ordered precision when everything else felt chaotic. And then that world had shattered, the case, the one that had never been solved, the one that had splintered my family and left me haunted by unanswered questions. I stared at the files, the printed words blurring. This wasn't just a pattern, it was a personal echo. The killer wasn't just targeting, they were selecting, choosing victims who shared a bond that felt unnervingly familiar, almost sacred. How could they know such a private detail about these people? It wasn't something you advertised, not like a passion for hiking or cooking. It was a quiet, internal pursuit. A tremor of unease ran through me. My professional detachment, a carefully constructed wall I'd built over years, felt like it was crumbling. This wasn't just a puzzle to solve. It was a wound being reopened, a raw nerve exposed. The victims weren't just subjects for analysis. They were reflections, distorted and terrifying, of a past I thought I had contained. Grant, a voice cut through my thoughts, making me jump. The lead investigator stood in the doorway, a stack of freshly printed documents in their hand. Found anything? I cleared my throat, forcing my gaze back to the files, away from the phantom ticking in my ears. Maybe, I managed, my voice rougher than I intended. I couldn't tell them yet. Not until I understood the full implications. Not until I could separate the professional from the deeply, painfully personal. The implication was too profound, too unsettling. The killer knew something intimate about these victims, something that touched a raw nerve in my own history. And if they knew that, what else did they know? The chill in the teaching hospital morgue, empty observation gallery above, was a physical thing, seeping into my bones even through my wool coat. It was a sterile, unforgiving cold, like the metallic tang that seemed to linger in the air, a faint echo of its purpose. Below, the main examination floor was a grid of stainless steel and stark lighting, currently deserted. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of ventilation and the rustle of the thick case files I'd spread out across the observation gallery's polished railing. I deliberately sought out this solitude. After the last conversation, the one where I'd bitten back my real suspicions, I needed to untangle the knots in my own head. The ticking in my ears had subsided, replaced by a dull throb behind my eyes. I stared down at the scattered photographs, the police reports, the witness statements, a grim mosaic of suffering and confusion. The first disappearance years ago, the recent murders. On the surface, they were distinct. Different locales, varying methods of concealment, no obvious shared victimology beyond a general demographic. Yet the evidence, the new gruesome evidence, had screamed connection. I'd seen it, felt it. But what kind of connection? Not a simple escalation, not a copycat, something more deliberate. I pushed aside the latest crime scene photos, the ones depicting the grim tableau in the abandoned factory. Her left hand, severed, lay precisely 6 inches from her right foot. A macabre geometry. The missing woman's known belongings inventoried. A small silver locket. A worn leather journal. Her favorite scarf. All gone. No body, no trace, just the fading memory of him presence. This isn't adding up, Grant, I muttered to myself, my voice flat in the cavernous space. I picked up a magnifying glass, running it over a blown-up image from the most recent scene. The victim's face was serene, almost peaceful, despite the violence inflicted. No struggle, no fear etched into her features. That was a constant across the recent victims. Each one. A quiet surrender. Now it felt like more. I flipped back to the oldest case, the missing woman, her last known photograph. A bright smile, eyes full of life. Had she surrendered too, or had her disappearance been different? The detective had insisted on a connection based on some trace evidence analysis. A unique soil sample found at the factory, matching traces found at the missing woman's last known location. That was the physical link. My job was to find the psychological one. My eyes snagged on a detail in the recent crime scene photos, not the body itself, but the surrounding debris. The factory floor was littered with discarded machinery, rust, dust. It was out of place, utterly. I remembered seeing it in the evidence logs, noted as miscellaneous item. I dismissed it as something the killer might have dropped or an accidental inclusion. Now, a prickle of unease started at the base of my neck. I scanned the other recent cases. One victim, found in an abandoned warehouse, had a single dried sunflower petal resting on her chest. Another, discovered by the derelict dockyards, had a smooth gray river stone clutched in her hand. These were not random. These were offerings. My breath hitched. Offerings, ritual. I slammed my palm down on the files, a sharp crack echoing in the quiet gallery. This wasn't about the victims' lives, not directly. It was about their deaths. And what came after? The objects weren't dropped, they were placed. Each one specific, symbolic. The wooden bird, freedom. The sunflower petal, adoration, longevity. The river stone, stability, permanence. And the missing woman, what would have been her offering? What would have been left behind had her body been found? A wave of nausea washed over me. I'd been so focused on the how and the who that I'd missed the why of these specific, seemingly innocuous details. They weren't just clues, they were the killer's language. My mind raced, connecting the dots backward. The quiet surrender of the victims, the calculated placement of the bodies, the symbolic items. The killer wasn't just ending lives, they were performing a twisted ceremony, each murder a step in a larger, ritualistic process. But a ritual for what and for whom? The missing woman's locket, her journal, her scarf. Could those have been the original offerings? Taken by the killer as part of the initial ceremony, perhaps? My gut tightened. If so, the killer hadn't just evolved, they had refined their method. From taking objects from the victim to leaving objects with them. A subtle but profound shift. The world had just tilted on its axis. I had been looking for a motive in the victims' shared histories, in their connections to each other or a perpetrator. But the killer wasn't targeting who they were. They were targeting what they represented in a grander, more symbolic narrative. The locations, too: abandoned factory, derelict dockyards, a forgotten warehouse, places of past industry now fallen into disuse, places of transition, of decay, of forgotten purpose. This wasn't just about solitude for the act, it was about the message of the place itself. A liminal space, a threshold. My mind, usually so precise, felt like a churning whirlpool of new information. It was exhilarating and terrifying. The killer wasn't just one step ahead, they were playing an entirely different game. A game of symbols, of ritual, of a narrative I was only just beginning to decipher. I closed my eyes, picturing the wooden bird again, its smooth, polished surface, its delicate wings. It was a message, and I had been deaf to it. This new understanding, this breakthrough, felt less like triumph and more like the heavy weight of a new, even more complex burden. This wasn't just about finding a killer anymore. It was about understanding a profound, disturbing declaration. And I had a sickening feeling that the declaration was far from over. Below, the main examination floor lay still, the steel tables gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, ready for their next grim occupant. I'd been up here for hours, poring over crime scene photos, victimology reports, and the few unsettling personal effects recovered from the recent murder sites. My notes were a frantic spiderweb across a dozen legal pads, each line a thread connecting the disparate, gruesome details. The pieces had finally clicked, not with a bang, but with a quiet, sickening inevitability. It wasn't just about the original disappearance of the young woman all those years ago. That was merely the seed. The killer had evolved, or perhaps always intended to. I heard the heavy door creak open behind me, and the footsteps of the detective echoed on the polished concrete. He stopped a respectful distance away, not needing to ask if I'd found anything. He could probably smell the desperation on me. "Grant," he added, his voice a low rumble. "Anything?" I turned, my eyes gritty, but my mind was sharp, honed by exhaustion and a sudden, terrifying clarity. "It's not about revenge for the original victim, not directly." I began, my voice raspy. "It's about replication. He's not just killing, he's recreating. Each recent victim, each location, they're not random, they are echoes." The detective frowned, his brow furrowed in a familiar gesture of skepticism mixed with weary hope. "Echoes of what?" "The original disappearance," I clarified, walking over to a corkboard I'd set up, covered with photos and maps. "Think about the first victim. Her interests, her routines, the places she frequented. He's not targeting people who knew her, or even people who resemble her physically. He's targeting people who embody aspects of her life, and he's doing it in locations that mirror places important to her. I pointed to a faded newspaper clipping of the first victim, a bright-eyed young woman named Sarah. Sarah was an amateur historian, obsessed with local lore, forgotten landmarks. She volunteered at the city's historical archives, spent hours sifting through old documents, maps, photographs. I moved my finger across the map, tracing a line between the recent crime scenes. Victim 1, a retired librarian found in a dilapidated book warehouse. Victim 2, a local genealogist found near an abandoned dock, a spot known for its old shipping records. Victim 3, a collector of antique maps discovered in a disused underground bunker that served as an air raid shelter during the war. Now a forgotten relic. The detective's eyes widened slowly as he followed my logic. So he's targeting people connected to history, to preserving the past, and the locations he's curating. He's building a morbid tableau, a macabre homage to the life and eventual erasure of Sarah. Each victim is a piece of her. Each location is a stage. So what's next? He pressed, the urgency creeping into his tone. If he's following a pattern, there has to be a next step. I spun around, grabbing a marked-up city map from the board. I cross-referenced Sarah's old volunteer logs, her personal journals, even her library checkout records. One place kept coming up over and over. An old, forgotten manor house on the outskirts of the city, the Blackwood Estate. It's been abandoned for decades, slated for demolition. Sarah spent weeks there before she vanished, trying to document its history before it was torn down. She called it the last bastion of forgotten stories. Blackwood Estate, the detective muttered, pulling out his radio. That place is a ruin. Nobody goes there. That's precisely why it's perfect, I replied, my voice rising with a frantic edge. It's the ultimate forgotten landmark, and based on the escalating timeline, the increasingly bold nature of the attacks, I think he's planning something big there. Something to complete his twisted narrative. Tonight, or dawn at the latest. My gut churned. I wasn't just predicting, I was almost feeling his next move. He turned to me. Coming with us. It wasn't a question. Minutes later, we were in an unmarked car, sirens wailing, cutting through the waking city. The sky was now a bruised purple, promising a gray morning. The adrenaline was a bitter taste in my mouth, mingling with the phantom metallic tang from the morgue. I kept replaying my profile, searching for any cracks, any misstep. What if I was wrong? What if my carefully constructed web of connections was nothing but a delusion, spun from exhaustion and desperation? The lives of real people hung on my interpretation. The drive was a blur of flashing lights and guttural radio chatter. We met up with a dozen other units on a desolate stretch of road leading to the Blackwood Estate. The manor loomed in the distance, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky. Its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring out at the world. It felt ancient, heavy with untold stories. We moved in fast, a dozen officers fanning out, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. Stay close to me. I followed the detective through a gaping hole in a crumbling stone wall into what must have once been a manicured garden, now overgrown with thorny brambles. Moonlight filtered through the shattered roof, creating ghostly patterns on the cracked marble floor. The place was a maze of decaying grandeur. We moved from room to room, the beam of my flashlight dancing across peeling wallpaper, overturned furniture, forgotten portraits staring out with vacant eyes. Then we found it. In what must have been the grand ballroom, now a cavernous space filled with rubble, a single, antique writing desk stood upright, meticulously cleaned. On its surface, a collection of old documents neatly arranged. A quill pen rested beside an open inkwell, and beside it a single, perfectly preserved, dried rose. It was a tableau just as I'd predicted, but there was no victim. Just this carefully staged scene, pristine amidst the decay. The detective swore under his breath. He was here, he just left. My eyes scanned the room, landing on a small, almost imperceptible detail. A faint sheen on the desk's polished surface, not dust, but a residue. I leaned closer, sniffing. A faint, sweet scent like dried herbs mingled with something metallic. It wasn't blood, not exactly. It was more subtle, more sinister. And then I saw it, barely visible in the faint light, a single thin scratch mark on the wooden floor leading from the desk towards a gaping hole in the wall where a secret passage might have once been. He hadn't just left. He had vanished, leaving behind a signature, a taunt. The killer was always one step ahead, and he was getting bolder, much bolder. The The residue on the desk, that faint, almost floral sweetness undercut by something sharper like old iron. It had snagged at the edge of my awareness, a whisper of a detail that refused to be dismissed. I'd spent the ride back to the precinct replaying it, trying to pin down the exact aroma, the feel of it. Not sticky, not oily, but a dry, fine powder, almost like a spice. "You're quiet," the lead detective observed, his gaze flicking to me in the rearview mirror. We were heading to the teaching hospital morgue, empty observation gallery above, a grim but necessary stop. Another body had turned up just hours after we'd left the last scene. The pattern was accelerating. "Just thinking about the last one," I replied, my voice a low rumble. "That residue, it's bothering me." "Forensics will get to it," he answered. Sounding weary, he probably thought I was obsessing over nothing. But I knew better. The devil, or in this case the killer, was always in the details. We pulled up to the stark, modern building. The air grew colder the moment we stepped inside, a sterile chill that permeated everything. We took the elevator up, the numbers climbing slowly. My mind drifted back to the scent dried herbs, metallic. It was like a memory just out of reach. A faint echo from a place I couldn't quite name. The double doors to the teaching hospital morgue, empty observation gallery above, swung open with a soft sigh. The gallery itself was a narrow, glass-enclosed space overlooking the main examination floor below. Stainless steel tables gleamed under bright, unforgiving lights. Empty for now, but the air still held that faint, distinctive scent of disinfectants and something else, something I couldn't place. He was already inside the main area, gesturing towards a gurney covered with a pristine white sheet. "Found in an abandoned warehouse down by the docks." "Same M.O." I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the scene below. My eyes, however, weren't focused on the new arrival. They were drawn to something else. On the railing of the observation gallery, directly in front of where I stood, was a small, ornate wooden box. It wasn't part of the usual equipment. It was clearly placed. My breath hitched. This wasn't right. The area should have been secured. "What's that?" I asked, my voice sharper than intended. The detective and the pathologist followed my gaze. The pathologist frowned. "I didn't see that earlier. Security must have missed it." I moved forward, my steps deliberate, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. The box was no bigger than my palm, intricately carved with what looked like stylized vines and leaves. It felt ancient, out of place in this sterile environment. As I reached it, I noticed a small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath its lid. My name, Grant, was written on it in elegant, looping script. This was it, the direct engagement. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked up the note. The paper felt thick, expensive. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes scanning the carefully penned words. "Grant, you see the threads, don't you? But you miss the weave, you always have. Some secrets are meant to stay buried like old bones. Your past is a testament to that. They wear familiar faces. Don't you remember the scent? The one that lingers after a truth is unearthed. The one that screams of what was lost. You will, soon. The Weaver." My gut tightened. The Weaver. Not only was this killer aware of me, they had a name for themselves, a name that perfectly encapsulated their meticulous, intricate work. And the mention of my past, the old bones, familiar faces, it hit too close to home. It was a direct jab at my own buried trauma, my own failures. How could they know? I looked up, my gaze sweeping the empty gallery, then down to the silent examination room. Had someone been here, watching? Had they just left it? Or was this a message from afar, a boast of their pervasive reach? The lack of security around this specific item was unnerving. It felt like a deliberate oversight, a stage set just for me. "Does it say?" the detective asked, his voice low, sensing the shift in my demeanor. I handed him the note, my hand still shaking faintly. He read it, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. "The Weaver and your past, what is this?" "It's a taunt," I managed, my voice hoarse. "A personal one." The phrase, "don't you remember the scent?" echoed in my mind. The dried herbs, the metallic tang. It was back, stronger now, linked to this note. It wasn't just a physical clue. It was a psychological one, aimed squarely at my memory, my subconscious. The pathologist, having finished her initial assessment of the new victim, joined us. She read the note over the detective's shoulder. "This is a new level of confidence and cruelty." Confidence, yes, I agreed, my mind racing, but also a distraction or a challenge. I looked at the small wooden box. I hadn't opened it. With the note in hand, I carefully lifted the lid. It was small, delicate, almost childlike, and beside it a small, intricately carved wooden bird. Its wings were spread as if in flight, its tiny eyes seemed to stare up at me. This wasn't just a taunt, it was a trophy, a grotesque signature. The dried leaves, they had that same faint, sweet herbal scent I detected on the desk. This was the source. This was the lingering aroma of the killer's presence. "This is from one of them?" the detective asked, his voice strained as he stared at the bone. "Likely," I replied, my gaze fixed on the tiny bird. "But which one? And why a bird?" "The old bones line," the pathologist murmured, pointing to the note. "And what was lost?" I ran a thumb over the smooth, cool wood of the bird, a symbol of freedom of flight, or perhaps of a cage. My mind flashed back to the first victim, the way he was found, almost posed, and he wants me to read it. The detective looked at me, a mixture of concern and frustration on his face. "But why I, Grant? Why is he singling I out?" That was the question, wasn't it? The killer knew something about me, something deeply personal, enough to craft this specific taunt. My past is a testament to that. Those words gnawed at me. My past was a tangled mess of regret and unanswered questions. Had I missed something? Was there a connection I hadn't seen? A forgotten case? A buried detail that linked me directly to this monster? "This isn't just about catching a killer anymore," I responded, looking at the bone, then at the note. "It's a game, and he just made his first move directly against me." I picked up the wooden bird, turning it over in my fingers. The craftsmanship was exquisite, too exquisite for a casual killer. This person had patience, skill, and an almost artistic dedication to their twisted craft. And the bird itself. It felt significant, not just a random trinket. It felt like a key. "Wait," I murmured, my eyes narrowing. The scent, the dried herbs, and this bird. My mind replayed the details of the first victim's apartment, the second victim's scene. Had there been anything at all that hinted at this? I hadn't processed it then, hadn't connected the dots. The scent was too subtle, too easily dismissed. But now, with this box, with this taunt, it screamed. The killer wasn't just leaving clues, he was leaving an experience. An immersive one designed to draw me in, to force me to confront not just the victims, but my own perceptions, my own blind spots, my own weaknesses. "What doesn't add up?" the detective pressed. "The confidence," I replied, my gaze fixed on the small wooden bird. "He's bold, yes, but to place this here in a supposedly secure area for me, it's a huge risk. Unless he wants me to think it's a risk. Unless he knows something about this place or its security that we don't. Or perhaps he wants us to know he can get anywhere, anytime. It's not just about the message. This killer wasn't just playing chess. He was playing with the entire board and every piece on it. And he'd just shown me that he knew my vulnerabilities, my personal history, better than I cared to admit. The game had just escalated, and I was no longer just an observer. I was a target and a pawn, a mere consultant. I was a player whether I liked it or not, and the killer had just dealt me a hand I hadn't asked for. He knew my vulnerabilities, my personal history, better than I cared to admit. The game had just escalated, and I was no longer just an observer, an analyst from a safe distance. I was a target, or at the very least, a pawn whose movements were being carefully orchestrated. The chill that had seeped into my bones followed me, even hours later, to the sterile quiet of the teaching hospital morgue, specifically its empty observation gallery above. The air here was always frigid, a calculated preservation against decay, but tonight it felt like a deliberate assault. I leaned against the cold metal railing, looking down into the brightly lit, deserted preparation area. Stainless steel gleamed under the harsh fluorescent tubes, reflecting my tired face back at me. A row of empty gurneys sat like sentinels, awaiting their next occupant. The silence was thick, broken only by the low hum of unseen ventilation systems. It was the kind of silence that amplified every doubt, every stray thought, every whisper of my own past. I hadn't come here for new evidence. The initial forensic reports were already etched into my memory, the gruesome details replaying on a loop. I was here for perspective, for a space devoid of distraction where I could finally untangle the knot of information and personal threats. The killer's message to me wasn't just a taunt. It was a psychological anchor, designed to pull me into the undertow of his design. Why me? Why now? My gaze drifted over the white-tiled floor, imagining the scenes that had unfolded here, the countless stories laid bare on those steel tables. Each victim a tragedy, each case a puzzle, but this one felt different. The recent murders, brutal and theatrical, were connected by the most tenuous, yet undeniable thread to the disappearance of the young woman years ago. That thread wasn't just physical, it was deeply, fundamentally psychological. I pulled out the laminated case files I'd brought with me, spreading them across the railing. A prominent city official, a respected academic, a seemingly innocuous charity fundraiser. No obvious connections, no shared social circles, no financial ties. I murmured to the empty room, my voice hoarse. It's about what they represent. I'd been so focused on the how and the who that I'd perhaps overlooked the foundational why. The killer wasn't just punishing, they were articulating. And the language they were using was one of profound, ancient grievance. A promising student, a scholarship winner, a bright future abruptly extinguished. But not, I realized, for everyone. The detective had theorized a simple revenge plot, perhaps related to a past slight or betrayal. But the precision, the symbolic nature of the recent killings felt grander, more deeply rooted than mere vengeance. It felt like a reenactment, a public shaming, a correction of a historical record. Wait, I thought, a sudden prickle of unease. Family, friends, a few acquaintances, a former employer, standard procedure. But then I noticed a name listed as a person of interest who was quickly cleared due to an airtight alibi. A young man, a fellow student, who had apparently been deeply infatuated with her. He'd been dismissed as a sad, lovesick puppy, a red herring. What if it was about what happened to her, or what she unwittingly represented? I closed my eyes, trying to strip away all the layers of my own involvement, my own fears. To see the killer's mind as a pure, unadulterated system of belief. The city official, the academic, the charity fundraiser. They were all pillars of the community, figures of authority, gatekeepers of institutions, and the gruesome evidence left with each recent victim. It wasn't random. It was a commentary, a judgment. My breath hitched. The weight that doesn't add up moment hit me like a physical blow. The alibi, the airtight alibi of the lovesick student. It had cleared him of her disappearance. But what if her disappearance wasn't the crime he cared about? What if it was merely the catalyst? What if the true injustice wasn't her vanishing, but something else that her vanishing allowed to be buried? Something that implicated the very institutions represented by the recent victims, not looking for who took her, but for what else went wrong around that time. Her scholarship, for instance, had been funded by a prominent local endowment, overseen by a board that included the city official, the academic, and the charity fundraiser. The pieces slammed together with a sickening crunch, a cover-up. She hadn't been the killer's target, he had been the killer's first victim of circumstance. Her vanishing had allowed a profound injustice, a systemic corruption, to be swept under the rug. And the killer, the lovesick student who had been dismissed, wasn't just infatuated with her. He was perhaps the only one who knew the truth, the only one who saw the original injustice for what it was. He wasn't avenging her death. He was avenging the truth that died with her disappearance. He was exposing the lie that had festered for years, meticulously taking down those who had benefited from it or had been complicit in its concealment. The gruesome evidence wasn't just torture, it was a symbolic indictment of their specific roles in that ancient wrong. My hands trembled, clutching the files. This wasn't about personal vendetta against individuals. It was about a deeply personal crusade against a monumental institutional betrayal. The killer wasn't just playing chess. He was tearing down the entire corrupted edifice, brick by painstaking brick. And I, with my own past traumas, my own unresolved questions about justice, was the perfect audience. He wasn't just playing with the board. He was trying to force me to see the rotten foundation it stood up. I finally understood the why, and that understanding, instead of bringing clarity, only heightened the tension, made the killer's game infinitely more terrifying. Because if I was right, he wouldn't stop until every single truth was unearthed, no matter the cost. And he had just shown me he was willing to use anything, even my own history, to make sure I paid attention. The air in the teaching hospital morgue, empty observation gallery above, was a steady, frigid hum. It settled into my bones, a constant reminder of the finality of things, a stark counterpoint to the vibrant, chaotic lives I spent my days trying to reconstruct. Below, the steel tables gleamed under the sterile lights, vacant for now, but their purpose was never far from my mind. I'd hold a stack of files up here, needing the quiet, the isolation, the peculiar, almost sacred stillness this place offered for deep thought. My focus, as the previous night had ended, was entirely on the why. The killer wasn't just enacting violence, they were performing a ritual, a macabre theater of retribution. The language they spoke, through their victims and their gruesome staging, was one of profound, ancient grievance. I'd shuffled through the cold case victim's background report countless times, each page a faint echo of a life abruptly cut short years ago. Now, I saw it not as a standalone tragedy, but as the prologue to a much longer, bloodier story. I spread the yellowed documents across the cold metal counter, the only surface available. The cold case victim, a vibrant woman in her early 20s, had seemed to live an unremarkable life, if you only skimmed the surface. A few friends, a steady but uninspiring job, no known enemies. That last detail had always nagged at me. No one disappears without someone having a reason. Not like this. What about her specifically could have ignited such a simmering, long-held fury? It wasn't about her recent past, I was sure of it. The killer's methods, the sheer meticulousness, the symbolic elements, they screamed of something deeply rooted, something that had been allowed to fester, warp, and finally explode. My gaze landed on a section I'd previously dismissed as administrative filler, a summary of her family's financial history. Her father, a small-time contractor, had been involved in a protracted, bitter legal dispute over a land parcel almost 2 decades prior. It was a minor footnote in the report, resolved in his favor, a nuisance suit that had barely registered. But as I read it again, a different light began to refract through the details. The opposing party in that old dispute had been a local family, the surname faintly familiar from other, tangential files I'd reviewed. They'd lost everything in the fallout: their property, their business, their reputation. They'd been driven out of town, ruined. The name of the family member who had spearheaded that losing legal battle leaped out at me, a man then in his late 30s, fiercely protective of his ancestral land. The report described him as intransigent and unyielding, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. He'd seen the loss not as a legal defeat, but as a profound betrayal, a theft sanctioned by the courts. My heart gave a jolt. This was it. This was the ancient grievance. One victim had been a minor judge's assistant, involved in property law. Another, an aging land surveyor who had provided testimony in several local cases. A third, a genealogist who had worked for a firm specializing in tracing old land deeds. They represented the system that had, in the killer's eyes, perpetrated the original injustice. They were targeting the pillars of the system that had wronged him. He was merely the daughter of the man who had benefited from that system. He was the initial, symbolic strike, the opening salvo in a war of vengeance that had been simmering for years, waiting for the right moment to erupt. The precision, the patience, the symbolic nature of the recent victims, it all clicked into place. This wasn't a random spree. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign of retribution, executed by someone who had nursed a deep, festering wound for decades. I needed to find out what happened to that man, the one who lost everything. The files showed he'd vanished after the legal defeat, presumably leaving town with his disgraced family. But people don't just disappear without a trace, not entirely. My fingers flew across the keyboard of my tablet, pulling up public records, old news archives, anything that mentioned the family. It was painstaking work, sifting through decades of digital dust. Then, a small article from a regional paper, almost 20 years old, caught my eye. A short piece about a small, independent antique restoration business opening up in a nearby, quiet town. The owner's name, it was a variation of the family name, but the first name was different. A son, perhaps. I cross-referenced the names. The son, then a young man, would have been old enough to remember the family's ruin vividly, old enough to feel the sting, to internalize the grievance. And an antique restorer, that profession demanded meticulous attention to detail, patience, a reverence for the past traits that perfectly aligned with the killer's methodical approach. It also offered a certain anonymity, a quiet existence where one could nurse a grudge unnoticed. I pulled up a photo from an old business registry. The man in the grainy image, though younger, had the same intense gaze, the same set to his jaw, described in the old legal reports as unyielding. He was still in the region. He hadn't vanished. He had merely receded into the background, watching, waiting. There was this too perfect. There was I forcing the pieces to fit, simply because I needed an answer. The human mind, after all, was an expert at pattern recognition, even where no pattern truly existed. The motive, the victims, the killer's psychological profile, it all pointed to him. The ancient grievance, the methodical precision, the symbolic targets. This wasn't just a suspect. This was the embodiment of the killer's very raison d'etre. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling slightly. "It's Grant," I added when the detective answered, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I think I've found him. It goes back 2 decades." Immediately, the hunt, I knew, was finally closing in. But the killer had proven to be cunning, always a step ahead. He wouldn't go quietly. The name, when it finally surfaced, felt less like a victory and more like the first ripple in a much larger, darker pool. It was a name tethered to nothing obvious, a ghost in the system that only a deep dive into cold, forgotten records could have unearthed. But a name was just an anchor. The real danger, the true horror, lay in the mind behind it. This individual, this architect of suffering, wasn't just a killer. He was a storyteller, a twisted artist obsessed with his own narrative. The low hum of the refrigeration units below was a constant, unnerving drone, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was late, the facility deserted save for the diligent night attendant I'd convinced to grant me access. From my vantage point, the polished stainless steel tables gleamed under the stark fluorescent lights, each one a silent stage for a tragedy. It was a place of endings, but for me, it felt like a beginning. My gaze drifted over the empty tables, picturing the forms that had once lain there, each one a piece of the killer's elaborate puzzle. He didn't just murder, he curated. It wasn't random. It was a sequence, a progression. He wasn't trying to hide, he was trying to communicate. He wants to be understood, I murmured to the empty room, my voice echoing faintly. He wants an audience. The detective, a stoic man who had seen too much, had scoffed at my theories initially. Killers want to get away, Grant. They don't want a standing ovation. This one does, I'd insisted. He leaves breadcrumbs not to be caught but to be recognized. He's not just taking lives, he's correcting what he perceives as injustices, and he sees himself as righteous. The final act of any righteous crusader is to explain his truth to the world. The detective just grunted, but he listened. He always did, eventually. I stopped pacing, leaning against the cool metal railing that separated the gallery from the lower level. The air was heavy, carrying the faint, metallic scent that always seemed to cling to these places. He knew we were close. The media, though carefully managed, had started to buzz with the specific details we'd released, carefully chosen to prick his ego. He'd seen the net tightening, felt the pressure. A cornered animal was dangerous, but a cornered artist was predictable. All this time, I'd been trying to find him, but he wasn't hiding, he was waiting for someone to truly appreciate the depth of his work. He wanted to control the narrative of his capture, to make it part of his grand design. He craved the confrontation, the opportunity to explain his justice to the one person he believed might truly grasp its significance. Me, this was it. This was his final trap, and I was the bait. And I knew with absolute certainty that I had to step into it. The plan began to form, a dangerous, delicate web spun from the threads of his own psychology. He saw himself as superior, as the ultimate judge. He would expect us to chase him, to make mistakes. But what if we offered him a platform, a chance to articulate his twisted philosophy, live, to an audience he believed was worthy? He wouldn't be able to resist. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but also a grim sense of purpose. I pulled out my phone, fingers hovering over the contact for the lead detective. I needed to convince him, and that wouldn't be easy. This wasn't a standard police procedure. It was a gamble, a psychological chess match where the stakes were impossibly high. I need a controlled environment, I muttered, thinking aloud. Somewhere he feels he has the upper hand, where we can contain him. The teaching hospital morgue, empty observation gallery above, was a potent symbol, a place of death and discovery, but it wasn't the right stage for him. He'd want something more grand, more public, yet still isolated enough for his performance. My mind raced, filtering through possibilities. An abandoned theater, a desolate warehouse with a history, no, too obvious. He'd want something that resonated with his victims, with his message, something that spoke to forgotten truths, to hidden sins. Then it clicked. The old municipal records office, slated for demolition, full of dusty files and forgotten stories. It was a labyrinth, perfect for someone who reveled in uncovering secrets, and it had an imposing central hall, a perfect, if crumbling, stage. I typed out a message to the detective, outlining the bare bones of my idea. I didn't mention the bait yet, not explicitly. I needed him to buy into the concept first. He wants to explain himself. Let's give him a stage, a specific, resonant location where he feels in control. I think I know where. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet. This was reckless. It was dangerous. I was putting myself directly in the crosshairs of a deeply disturbed, highly intelligent killer. The thought of confronting him, of looking into the eyes of the man who had orchestrated such horror, was terrifying. What if he was even more unpredictable than I imagined? What if he didn't care about an audience and simply wanted to add another victim to his collection? But the doubt was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by a grim determination. I knew his patterns, his needs. His arrogance would be his undoing, and if I was wrong, if this was truly a trap for me, then at least I would face him. The confrontation was coming. I could feel it in the charged air, in the prickle on my skin. The hunt was over. The game, however, was just beginning, and I was ready to play my part. The chill in the air was less about temperature and more about the palpable dread that clung to the sterile surfaces of the teaching hospital morgue, specifically the empty observation gallery above where I stood. The glass panel, thick and unforgiving, separated me from the rows of stainless steel gurneys below, each one a monument to a life extinguished. The hum of the ventilation system was the only sound, a low, constant thrum that did little to soothe the frantic rhythm of my pulse. I had walked into this. I had sought it out. The thought clawed at me, a cold doubt that perhaps I wasn't as clever as I needed to be, that I was merely a moth drawn to a deadly flame. Then, a flicker of movement below. The killer. He didn't look up immediately, instead running a gloved hand along the edge of one of the gurneys, a gesture of perverse reverence. My breath hitched, caught somewhere between my throat and my lungs. This was it. The culmination of weeks spent chasing ghosts and deciphering the grotesque calligraphy of a twisted mind. Finally, he lifted his head, his gaze sweeping the gallery with an unnerving precision. He knew I was here. He expected me. It wasn't loud, yet it resonated with an authority that made the hairs on my arms prickle. Always so predictable, always drawn to the spectacle. I gripped the railing, my grip tight. I wanted me here, I stated, my voice steadier than I felt. I led me here. He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound that bounced off the tiled walls. Of course, how else could I explain, how else could I truly see? He gestured vaguely at the empty room, then at the gurneys. This is where the truth lies, isn't it? Stripped bare, unadorned. My eyes scanned the room below, searching for anything out of place, any sign of the potential victim the detective had warned me about. Nothing immediately apparent. Or the recent victims. He took a few steps, stopping beside a large metal cabinet, its drawers gleaming. All of them. They are all connected, Grant, all part of the same grand design. You've been so close, haven't you? Circling the drain of understanding. He opened one of the cabinet drawers with a soft hiss. Inside, nestled on a sterile sheet, was not a body but a collection of items. A tarnished silver locket. A child's drawing faded at the edges. A pressed flower. The one belonging to the disappeared young woman. Why here? Because this is where the old truth died, he answered, his voice dropping, losing its earlier calm. They let her disappear. They forgot her. They let the injustice fester. His gaze hardened, locking onto mine through the glass. But I didn't forget. I never forget. I think I read delivering justice. I challenged, my mind racing, trying to find the crack in his delusion. By taking innocent lives. By replicating the very violence I claim to abhor. Innocent, he scoffed, a sharp, bitter sound. There are no innocents, Grant, only the complicit, the ones who looked away, the ones who profited, the ones who built their lives on the ashes of another's suffering. He pulled a small, folded piece of paper from his pocket, holding it up. This is what they found in her pocket. A list of names. The victim from years ago had been connected to something bigger, something beyond a simple disappearance. This was the missing link, the revelation the detective had been hunting for. And you decided to enact your own judgment, I stated, the pieces starting to click into a horrifying picture. Each of your victims, they were on that list, weren't they? But there's one more, Grant, one more who needs to understand the weight of their inaction. He turned, and my gaze followed, finally spotting her. He was there, strapped to one of the gurneys near the back, obscured by a large, wheeled metal trolley. Unconscious, pale but breathing, my stomach dropped. He was the final piece, the ultimate message. You can't do this, I responded, my voice rising, abandoning the pretense of calm. This isn't justice. This is vengeance, it's madness. Madness, he tilted his head, his eyes glinting. Or clarity, you of all people, Grant, should appreciate the fine line, the way trauma warps perception, the way a single injustice can ripple through generations, demanding recompense. He took a step towards the gurney where the assistant lay, a small, glinting object appearing in his gloved hand, a surgical tool, long and slender. My heart thundered. I had to act, but what? The glass was too thick. There was no immediate access to the lower level from the gallery. I was trapped, a witness to a horror unfolding. It won't bring her back, I pleaded, trying one last time to appeal to some shred of humanity. It won't erase the past. It will only create more victims, more pain. He paused, his hand hovering over the unconscious woman. Perhaps not for her, he conceded, his voice almost gentle, but for them. He gestured again at the locket and the drawing on the gurney. And for me, it brings a certain, you know what it feels like to be consumed. For a terrifying second, I felt a flicker of understanding, a dangerous empathy that threatened to cloud my judgment. Had I miscalculated? Had I underestimated the depth of his brokenness, mistaking it for pure evil? This wasn't just a killer. This was a reflection, twisted and monstrous, of the very pain I sought to understand. He was closer to me than I wanted to admit. But that flicker, that momentary doubt, vanished as he lowered the surgical tool, its tip glinting dangerously close to the woman's exposed neck. He was a monster. Yes, but a monster I had to stop. And I was still above him. I had to find a way down, and fast. The chill in the teaching hospital morgue, empty observation gallery above, seemed to seep directly into my bones. It wasn't the kind of cold that made you shiver, but a deep, pervasive coolness that settled in your chest, a stark counterpoint to the adrenaline that had surged through me mere hours ago. I leaned against the cool glass, my reflection a pale, indistinct smudge against the brighter lights of the examination room below. The scene of the capture replayed in my mind, a jagged film reel. His words, his raw, desperate confession of a broken life, had momentarily snagged something deep inside me. Had I miscalculated? Had I underestimated the depth of his brokenness? That flicker of understanding, that dangerous empathy, still pricked at the edges of my thoughts. He confessed to everything, Grant. The lead detective's voice, gravelly with exhaustion, pulled me back. He stood a few feet behind me, a steaming cup clutched in his hands, the faint aroma of bitter coffee cutting through the antiseptic air. The initial disappearance, the subsequent victims, all linked, just like you said. He laid it all out, a meticulous chronicle of his warped justice. I turned, pushing away from the glass. Meticulous is the word. He didn't just kill them, he dissected their perceived moral failings. Each act was a judgment, a twisted form of retribution for the original slight he believed he suffered. The detective nodded, taking a slow sip. He never forgave the young woman for leaving him, did he? And when he saw others years later exhibiting what he considered similar carelessness or disrespect towards relationships, it just snapped. It wasn't a snap, I corrected, my voice quiet. It was a slow, deliberate erosion. He cultivated that resentment, nurtured it like a venomous plant. The initial disappearance wasn't a catalyst for immediate violence, but for a profound psychological restructuring. He spent years building his internal justification, creating a system where he was both victim and arbiter. The later killings were the horrifying manifestation of that system, each one an attempt to re-establish a control he felt he'd lost. The detective sighed, running a hand over his tired face. Hard to believe someone can hold on to that much hate for so long and just wait. That's what gets me. The waiting, the planning, the way he integrated his fantasy of vengeance into his daily life, observing, selecting, without anyone suspecting the depths of his internal landscape. The young woman's disappearance, it turns out, was the foundational stone of his monstrous edifice. He never wanted to find her. He wanted to become her judge, and then, by extension, judge anyone else he deemed guilty of similar transgressions against his warped moral code. The truth, in its stark simplicity, was almost harder to bear than the speculation. He hadn't just lost it. He had systematically built a new reality for himself, one where his actions were righteous. The discovery of the young woman's remains, hidden for so long, had been the final, undeniable link, revealing the true genesis of the horror. He hadn't just started killing. He had been a killer in his own mind for years before the recent string of murders. The new evidence hadn't just linked the cases, it had unearthed the very root of his pathology. I looked back down at the sterile room below, imagining the evidence that would pass through it. It was a strange kind of justice, born from meticulous forensic work and the painstaking reconstruction of a shattered mind. "So, what now for him?" I inquired, though I already knew the answer. "The system takes over," the detective said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He'll face charges for every single one. There's no doubt about his culpability. The evidence is overwhelming, and his confession, however rambling, fills in the last gaps." The confession, that was where the real challenge lay. That's where the dangerous empathy had come in, not as an excuse, but as a window into the twisted logic. It solidified my resolve rather than shaking it. My purpose wasn't to condemn, but to understand, to explain, to offer clarity where only chaos seemed to reign. The case was closed, legally speaking. The perpetrator was identified, captured, and soon to be held accountable. But the echoes of it I knew would linger. I pushed off the glass again, turning fully to face the detective. "Good work, all of you," he offered, a tired smile. "Couldn't have done it without you, Grant. Your insights, they were the key. You saw what no one else could." I didn't feel like a hero. I felt heavy, but beneath that weight, there was a strange clarity. This wasn't about closure for me, not in the traditional sense of clean slate. It was about acceptance. Acceptance of the profound capacity for cruelty within the human psyche and my own unique, often unsettling, ability to chart its contours. The quiet hum from below continued, a constant reminder of the physical aftermath of violence. But up here, in the quiet observation gallery, I felt a different kind of aftermath, a psychological one. The case had pushed me, tested my limits, forced me to confront the very nature of justice and the elusive motivations behind its perversion. And in doing so, it had reaffirmed my path, not as a healer, but as an explorer of the mind's most dangerous territories, seeking to understand the mechanisms of its collapse, hoping that in understanding, some measure of prevention, or at least explanation, could be found. The tension in my shoulders eased, replaced by a quiet, determined resolve.